So tonight's lecture deals with Chapter 23, the respiratory system, and this begins on page 891. The respiratory system contributes to homeostasis by providing for the exchange of the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, among the atmospheric air, blood, and tissue cells. It also helps adjust the pH of body fluids. The purpose of this chapter is to describe the anatomy of the respiratory system, understand the physiology of the respiratory system, describe the events that cause inhalation, exhalation, and gas exchange, and learn how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood. Anatomy of the respiratory system. The respiratory system is the set of organs that allows a person to breathe and exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body. The passage of air into the lungs to supply the body with oxygen is known as inhalation, and the passage of air out of the lungs to expel carbon dioxide is known as exhalation. This process is collectively called breathing or ventilation. The organs that are involved in breathing, including the nose, throat, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs, also known as the respiratory tree. Respiration is the exchange of gases between the atmosphere, blood, and cells. The combination of three processes is required for respiration to occur. Ventilation, external respiration, and internal respiration are the three processes. During pulmonary ventilation or breathing, the inhalation and exhalation of air involves the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the pulmonary alveoli of the lungs. Inhalation permits oxygen to enter the lungs, and exhalation permits carbon dioxide to leave the lungs. External or pulmonary respiration is the exchange of gases between the pulmonary alveoli of the lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries across the respiratory membrane. In this process, pulmonary capillary blood gains oxygen and loses carbon dioxide. And then internal or tissue respiration is the exchange of gases between blood in the systemic capillaries and tissue cells. In this step, the blood loses oxygen and gains carbon dioxide. Within cells, the metabolic reactions that consume oxygen and give off carbon dioxide during the production of ATP are termed cellular respiration, and this is discussed further in Chapter 25. Furthermore, the cardiovascular system assists the respiratory system by transporting gases. The respiratory system, which includes air passages, pulmonary vessels, the lungs, and breathing muscles, aids the body in the exchange of gases between the air and blood, and between the blood and the body's billions of cells. Most of the organs of the respiratory system help to distribute air, but only the tiny, grape-like alveoli and the alveolar ducts are responsible for the actual gas exchange. Functions of the respiratory system. The main function of the respiratory system is air distribution, and this includes gas exchange, filtration, warms and humidifies the incoming air, plays a role in speech, plays a role in the sense of smell. It helps the body to maintain homeostasis, and it helps the body to regulate its pH. Structures of the respiratory system. Structurally, the components of the respiratory system are divided into two parts: the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. The upper respiratory system includes the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, and associated structures. The lower respiratory system includes the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. Functionally, the respiratory system also consists of two parts. The conducting zone, which consists of a series of interconnecting cavities and tubes both outside and within the lungs. These includes the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles. Their function is to filter, warm, and moisten air and conduct it into the lungs. Secondly, the respiratory zone consists of tubes and tissues within the lungs where gas exchange occurs. These include respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar saccules, and the pulmonary alveoli, and are the main states of gas exchange between the air and blood. Moving on to the next slide, the respiratory system is divided into two main components. The upper respiratory tract, composed of the nose, the pharynx, and the larynx. The organs of the upper respiratory tract are located outside the chest cavity. The nasal cavity, the external nose, which includes the nasal bone and cartilage that forms the nostrils. The internal nose, which includes the nasal cavity, divided into two halves by the nasal septum. This warms, filters, and humidifies the air that you breathe. Inside the nose, a sticky mucous membrane lining the nasal cavity traps dust particles, and tiny hairs called cilia help move them to the nose to be sneezed or blown out. And also, we need to mention the sinuses, and these are air-filled spaces along the side of the nose that make the skull lighter. So here we're looking at figure 23.2 on page 893. This shows the structures of the respiratory system. The upper respiratory system includes the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, and associated structures. The lower respiratory system includes the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So in letter A, we see an anterior view showing the organs of respiration in cartoon form. And at letter B, we see an anterior view of the lungs and the heart after removal of the anterolateral thoracic wall and pleura. So this is actually a photo from a real cadaver. Moving on. Respiratory system anatomy continued. The upper respiratory system consists of the nose, pharynx, and associated structures. This is like the 5th time I've said this, so it must be important. The lower respiratory system consists of the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So in this figure, it spans page 894 and 895. This is figure 23.3. And this particular cartoon is on page 895. But what we're looking at here is this parasagittal plane of the nose, pharynx, larynx, and trachea. So you can study this and become familiar with the various parts of the anatomy of this view. Going back to page 894, the same figure, the external portion of the nose is made of cartilage and skin and is lined with the mucous membrane. So as air passes through the nose, it is warmed, filtered, and moistened, and olfaction also occurs. So back to page 895, and we've already looked at this cartoon one time, but we'll look at it again, because now the book is pointing out to you the bony framework of the nose, which is formed by the frontal, nasal, and maxillary bones. So you should already be familiar with those bones from our lecture in 221 on the skeletal system. So on this next slide, we're looking at page 896. We're still on figure 23.3. And now we have a frontal plane view from a cadaver. And this is pointing out the nasal conchae and the meatuses. So the conchae almost reaches the nasal septum, and it subdivides the side of the nasal cavity into a series of groove-like air passageways. These passageways are the superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatuses. The mucous membrane lines the nasal cavity and its shelves. The arrangement of conchae and meatuses increases the surface area of the internal nose and prevents dehydration by trapping water droplets during exhalation. And then if you quickly turn back to page 895, we can see the sagittal section of the skull there. So review that. That shows you some more of the anatomy of the nasal cavity. Moving on to figure 23.4 on page 896, the surface anatomy of the nose. The external nose has a cartilaginous framework and a bony framework. And you can see the various parts of the surface anatomy pointed out: the root, the apex, the bridge, and the external nares. The root is a superior attachment of the nose to the frontal bone. The apex is the tip of the nose. The bridge is the bony framework of the nose formed by the nasal bones. And the external nares is also commonly called the nostril, and it's the external opening into the nasal cavity. The pharynx functions as a passageway for air and food, provides a resonating chamber for speech sounds, and houses the tonsils, which participate in immunological reactions against foreign invaders. And you can see the little cartoon there, and it outlines the regions of the pharynx in color. The pharynx continued. Both food and air pass through the pharynx before reaching their appropriate destinations. The pharynx also plays a role in speech. It consists of 3 sections: the nasopharynx, which contains the adenoids and the openings to the eustachian tubes; the oropharynx, which is located behind the mouth and contains the palatine tonsils; and the laryngopharynx, which is the lower portion of the pharynx. At the back of the laryngopharynx, food enters the esophagus while air enters the larynx in the front. And this is figure 23.5 on page 898. The larynx, or the voice box, is a passageway that connects the pharynx and the trachea. Furthermore, the larynx is composed of 9 pieces of cartilage. 23.5 continued, still on page 898. The larynx contains vocal folds which produce sound when they vibrate. And you can see the sagittal plane in the cartoon form in the upper left, and notice the vocal fold, which they call a true vocal cord. And this is figure 23.6 on page 900. This shows the structures of voice production. So the glottis consists of a pair of folds of mucous membrane in the larynx, in other words, the vocal folds, and the space between them, which is also called the rima glottidis. The lower respiratory tract is composed of the trachea, the lungs, and all segments of the bronchial tree, including the alveoli. The organs of the lower respiratory tract are located inside the chest cavity. So the trachea, located just below the larynx, the trachea is the main airway to the lungs. Bronchi. The bronchi branch from the trachea into each lung and create the network of intricate passages that supply the lungs with air. The lungs. Together, the lungs form one of the body's largest organs. They're responsible for providing oxygen to capillaries and exhaling carbon dioxide. And the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the main respiratory muscle that contracts and relaxes to allow air into the lungs. So moving on to figure 23.7 on page 901, the trachea extends from the larynx to the primary bronchi. So if we look at this view, we see that the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. Moving on to page 902, figure 23.8, at the superior border of the fifth thoracic vertebra, the trachea branches into a right primary bronchus, which enters the right lung, and a left primary bronchus, which enters the right lung. The bronchial tree consists of macroscopic airways that begin at the trachea and continue through the terminal bronchioles. This is a variation of the bottom of figure 23.8 on page 902, and it shows the outline of the branching of the bronchial tree, which moves from the trachea to the main bronchi, to the lobar bronchi, to the segmental bronchi, to the bronchioles, to the terminal bronchioles. Upon entering the lungs, the primary bronchi further divide to form smaller and smaller diameter branches. The terminal bronchioles are the end of the conducting zone. Blood supply to the lungs. Blood enters the lungs via the pulmonary arteries and the bronchial arteries. Blood exits the lungs via the pulmonary veins and the bronchial veins. So looking now at figure 23.9 on page 905, the lungs are enclosed and protected by the pleural membrane. The parietal pleura lines the thoracic cavity, and the visceral pleura covers the lungs. So this is figure 23.10 on page 906 and 907. And this goes into a little bit of the surface anatomy of the lungs. But you can see that the lungs are divided into lobes and they have fissures. The oblique fissures divide the left lung into two lobes, and the oblique and horizontal fissures divide the right lung into three lobes. Great quiz or exam question. Which lung has two lobes? Which lung has three lobes? Alveoli. When the conducting zone ends at the terminal bronchioles, the respiratory zone begins. The respiratory zone terminates at the alveoli, the air sacs found within the lungs. So if we look at figure 23.11 on page 908, we see this little beige box where it shows this pathway, the microscopic airwaves. This goes into the respiratory bronchioles, to the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and then the alveoli. This next slide, still figure 23.11 on page 908. So here we see in detail the alveoli and the alveolar sac. An alveolar saccule is the terminal dilation of an alveolar duct and is composed of the pulmonary alveoli. And then on the left we have a light microscope image of this lung lobule. Moving on to figure 23.12 on page 910. This shows the structural components of a pulmonary alveolus. The respiratory membrane consists of a layer of pneumocytes type 1 and pneumocytes type 2, an epithelial basement membrane, a capillary basement membrane, and the capillary endothelium. There are two kinds of alveolar cells, type 1 and type 2. And the exchange of respiratory gases occurs by diffusion across the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is composed of 1. A layer of type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells and associated alveolar macrophages that constitutes the alveolar wall. 2. An epithelial basement membrane underlying the alveolar wall. 3. A capillary basement membrane that is often fused to the epithelial basement membrane. And 4. A capillary endothelium. So this next slide shows table 23.1 on page 911. This gives you a nice summary of the structures of the respiratory system. So please review this slide on your own time. And this next slide is a continuation of Table 23.1. Again, review this on your own time. Moving on to pulmonary ventilation. In pulmonary ventilation, air flows between the atmosphere and the alveoli of the lungs because of alternating pressure differences created by contraction and relaxation of respiratory muscles. And the two phenomena are the inhalation and the exhalation. Breathing. Ventilation is a physical process to move air on and out of the lungs. And there are two mechanisms for this. The first one we call inspiration. This is the breathing of air into the lungs, also known as inhalation or inhaling. And then expiration, which is the expulsion of air from the lungs. This is also known as exhalation or exhaling. And the respiratory cycle is a single cycle of inspiration and expiration. So this is figure 23.13 on page 912, and this discusses Boyle's law. Pressure changes that drive inhalation and exhalation are governed in part by Boyle's law. So the volume of gas varies inversely with its pressure. Respiratory physiology. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases between interstitial fluid and cells. External respiration is the exchange of gases between the interstitial fluid and the external environment. The steps of external respiration are pulmonary ventilation, gas diffusion, and transport of the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So now we're viewing figure 23.14 on page 913, and this shows the muscles of inhalation and exhalation. During normal, quiet inhalation, the diaphragm and the external intercostals contract. The lungs expand, and the air moves into the pulmonary alveoli of the lungs. During normal, quiet exhalation, the diaphragm and external intercostals relax, and the lungs recoil, forcing air out of the pulmonary alveoli of the lungs. So as we look at this cartoon, we can see that the muscles of inhalation are on the left, and the muscles of exhalation are on the right. And the arrows indicate the direction of muscle contraction during breathing. This is the same figure on page 913, but this shows the position of the diaphragm during inhalation and exhalation. So changes in the size of the thoracic cavity during inhalation and exhalation assist in breathing. So moving on to page 23.15 on page 914. This discusses the pressure changes in the pulmonary ventilation. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, the chest expands, the lungs are pulled outward, and the alveolar pressure decreases. During exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, the lungs recoil inward, and the alveolar pressure increases, forcing air out of the lungs. Air moves into the lungs when the alveolar pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure, and out of the lungs when the alveolar pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure. So we see at step 1, when we're at rest, the diaphragm is relaxed. The alveolar pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure, and there is no airflow. Moving on to step 2, during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and the external intercostals contract. The chest cavity then expands and the alveolar pressure drops below atmospheric pressure. Air flows into the lungs in response to the pressure gradient and the lung volume expands. During deep inhalation, the scalene and sternocleidomastoid muscles expand the chest further, thereby creating a greater drop in alveolar pressure. At step 3, during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes and the external intercostals relax. The chest and lungs recoil, the chest cavity contracts, and the alveolar pressure increases above atmospheric pressure. Air flows out of the lungs in response to the pressure gradient, and the lung volume decreases. During forced exhalations, the intercostals and the abdominal muscles contract. This thereby reduces the size of the chest cavity further and creates a greater increase in alveolar pressure. Moving on to other factors affecting pulmonary ventilation. One is surface tension. This is defined as inwardly directed forces in the alveoli which must be overcome to expand the lungs during each inspiration. Elastic recoil. This decreases the size of the alveoli during expiration. And finally, compliance. This is the ease with which the lungs and thoracic wall can be expanded. Mechanisms of breathing. Quiet breathing. This uses the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. Forced breathing. This uses accessory muscles. Moving on to breathing patterns and respiratory movements. The term for the normal pattern of quiet breathing is eupnea. Eupnea can consist of shallow, deep, or combined shallow and deep breathing. A pattern of shallow chest breathing, called costal breathing, consists of an upward and outward movement of the chest due to contraction and of the external intercostal muscles. A pattern of deep breathing or abdominal breathing is called diaphragmatic breathing. This consists of the outward movement of the abdomen due to the contraction and descent of the diaphragm. Breathing also provides humans with methods for expressing emotions such as laughing, sighing, and sobbing, and can be used to expel foreign matter from the lower air passages through actions such as sneezing and coughing. Breathing movements are also modified and controlled during talking and singing. Some of the modified breathing movements that express emotion or clear the airways are listed in Table 23.2. All of these movements are reflexes, but some of them also can be initiated voluntarily. And that brings us to Table 23.2 on page 916. And this table discusses modified breathing movements, so please review this on your own time. So moving on to figure 23.16 on page 917. So this gets into lung volumes and capacity. During inhalation and exhalation, varying amounts of air move into and out of the lungs. These amounts depend on many factors related to various characteristics of healthy individuals and pulmonary disorders. The different amounts of air can be classified into two types: lung volumes, which can be measured directly by the use of a spirometer, and two lung capacities, which are combinations of different lung volumes. Moving on to the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. According to Dalton's law, each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure as if no other gases were present. And according to Henry's law, the quantity of gas that will dissolve in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility. For instance, in body fluids, the ability of a gas to stay in solution is greater when its partial pressure is higher and when it has a high solubility in water. The higher partial pressure of a gas over a liquid and the higher the solubility, the more gas will stay in solution. In comparison to oxygen, much more carbon dioxide is dissolved in blood plasma because the solubility of carbon dioxide is 24 times greater than that of oxygen. Even though the air we breathe contains mostly nitrogen, this gas has no known effect on bodily functions, and at sea level pressure, very little of it dissolves in blood plasma because its solubility is very low. External and internal respiration. During external respiration, oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. During this step, carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. During internal respiration, oxygen will diffuse from the systemic capillaries into the tissue. And in this step, carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. So here we have a variation of figure 23.17 on page 920. And this shows changes in partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide during external and internal respiration. So gases diffuse from the areas of higher partial pressure to areas of lower partial pressure. So check out the numbers that are around this figure. Remember, the pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. So the pulmonary alveolar air shows a pressure of about 105 millimeters of mercury and 40 millimeters of mercury concerning the carbon dioxide. The oxygenated blood shows 100 millimeters of mercury, and then the carbon dioxide concentration is the same. At the systemic tissue cells, we see that the oxygen is down to 40 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide is up to 45 millimeters of mercury. And then on the left-hand side there, we see the deoxygenated blood, where the oxygen is down to 40 millimeters of mercury, down even more from, I guess it's the same as the previous number, but the carbon dioxide concentration is the same. And then as it is exhaled into the air, we see the atmospheric air running about 159 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide is 0.3 millimeters of mercury. So that's all this slide is really doing, is showing you how the pressure of the air or the gases in your circulatory system change at each step of the process. Transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. So concerning oxygen, 1.5% of the oxygen is dissolved in the plasma. 98.5% of the oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. Concerning carbon dioxide, 7% of the carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma. 23% of the carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin inside red blood cells as carbaminohemoglobin. And then furthermore, 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ions. So as CO2 diffuses into the systemic capillaries and enters the red blood cells, it reacts with water in the presence of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into a hydrogen ion and sodium bicarbonate. Diffusion and respiratory function. Gas exchange across the respiratory membrane is efficient due to the following: differences in partial pressure of gases, small diffusion distance, lipid-soluble gases, large surface area of all alveoli, and the coordination of blood and airflow. Oxygen transport. Oxygen is mainly carried by the red blood cells bound to hemoglobin. The amount of oxygen carried by hemoglobin depends on three things: the pressure of the oxygen, the pH, and the temperature. Oxygen does not dissolve easily in water, so only about 1.5% of the inhaled oxygen is dissolved in blood plasma, which is mostly water. Therefore, about 98.5% of the oxygen is bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. Each 100 milliliters of oxygenated blood contains the equivalent of 20 milliliters of gaseous oxygen. Using the percentages just given, the amount dissolved in the blood plasma is 0.3 milliliters and the amount bound to hemoglobin is 19.7 milliliters. The heme portion of hemoglobin contains 4 atoms of iron, each capable of binding a molecule of oxygen. Oxygen and hemoglobin bind in an easily reversible reaction to form oxyhemoglobin. And if you look on your book in page 922, you can see a formula for that. The 98.5% of the oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin is trapped inside of red blood cells, so only the dissolved oxygen can diffuse out of the tissue capillaries into tissue cells. Thus, it is important to understand the factors that promote oxygen binding and dissociation from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide transport. 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma. 70% is carried as carbonic acid. This is a buffer system. 23% is bound to hemoglobin. And plasma also helps to transport it. Under normal resting condition, each 100 milliliters of deoxygenated blood contains the equivalent of 53 milliliters of gaseous carbon dioxide, which is transported in the blood in 3 main forms. Well, the dissolved carbon dioxide, this is the smallest percentage at about 7%, as we've already mentioned. This is dissolved in the blood plasma. On reaching the lungs, it diffuses into the alveolar air and is exhaled. Carbamino compounds, a somewhat higher percentage, about 23%, combines with the amino groups of amino acids and proteins in blood to form carboamino compounds. Because the most prevalent protein in blood is hemoglobin, most of the carbon dioxide transported in this manner is bound to hemoglobin. The main carbon dioxide binding sites are the terminal amino acids in the 2-alpha and 2-beta globin chains. Hemoglobin that has bound carbon dioxide is termed carbohemoglobin. There's a formula for this in your book as well, and this is on page 925. The formation of carbohemoglobin is greatly influenced by the pressure of carbon dioxide. For example, in tissue capillaries, the pressure of carbon dioxide is relatively high, which promotes the formation of carboaminohemoglobin, but in pulmonary capillaries, the pressure of carbon dioxide is relatively low, and the carbon dioxide readily splits apart from the globin and enters into the alveoli by diffusion. And then, of course, there's the bicarbonate ions, and this is the greatest percentage of carbon dioxide. About 70% is transported in the blood plasma as bicarbonate ions. And as I've already mentioned, as the carbon dioxide diffuses into the systemic capillaries and enters the red blood cells, it reacts with water in the presence of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into a hydrogen ion and sodium bicarbonate. And again, there's a formula for this on page 925. Thus, as blood picks up carbon dioxide, bicarbonate accumulates inside the red blood cells. Some bicarbonate moves out into the blood plasma down its concentration gradient. In exchange, chloride ions move from blood plasma into the red blood cells. This exchange of negative ions, which maintains the electrical balance between blood plasma and the red blood cell cytosol, is known as the chloride shift. The net effect of these reactions is that carbon dioxide is removed from tissue cells and transported in blood plasma as bicarbonate. As blood passes through pulmonary capillaries in the lungs, all of these reactions reverse and carbon dioxide is exhaled. So this brings us to figure 23.19 on page 923. This shows the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve showing the relationship between hemoglobin saturation and the pressure of oxygen at normal body temperature. As the pressure of oxygen increases, more oxygen combines with hemoglobin. And this next figure is 23.20 on page 924. Oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves showing the relationship of pH and the pressure of carbon dioxide to hemoglobin saturation at normal body temperatures. So what we see here is as pH increases or the pressure of carbon dioxide decreases, oxygen combines more tightly with hemoglobin so that less is available to tissues. The broken lines emphasize these relationships. And now we're looking at figure 23.21 on page 924. And this shows the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve showing the effect of temperature changes. So the gist of this is that as temperature increases, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen decreases. And then this is figure 23.22 on page 925. This shows the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve comparing fetal and maternal hemoglobin. So fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than does adult hemoglobin. And this is figure 23.23 on page 926. This is just a summary of chemical reactions that occur during the gas exchange. So hemoglobin inside red blood cells transports oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions. So on the top part of the cartoon, letter A, we see an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillaries, and this is an example of external respiration. As carbon dioxide is exhaled, hemoglobin inside red blood cells and pulmonary capillaries unloads carbon dioxide and picks up oxygen from the pulmonary alveolar air. The binding of oxygen to hemoglobin releases hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate dissociates into water and carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood plasma into the pulmonary alveolar air. To maintain electrical balance, a chloride ion exits the red blood cell for each bicarbonate that enters. And looking at the bottom of the figure on letter B, we see that carbon dioxide diffuses out of tissue cells that produce it and enters the red blood cells where some of it binds to hemoglobin, forming carboaminohemoglobin. This reaction causes oxygen to dissociate from the oxyhemoglobin. Other molecules of carbon dioxide combine with water to produce bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. As hemoglobin buffers hydrogen ions, the hemoglobin releases oxygen. This is the Bohr effect. To maintain electrical balance, a chloride ion enters the red blood cell for each bicarbonate that exits. And this is called chloride shift. Control of breathing begins on page 927. Control of ventilation refers to the physiological mechanisms involved in the control of physiological ventilation, which refers to the movement of air into and out of the lungs. Respiration refers to the uptake of oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide. Under most conditions, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide controls the rate of respiration. The most important function of breathing is gas exchange. Thus, the control of respiration is centered primarily on how well this is achieved by the lungs. There are four main centers in the reticular formation and other parts of the brainstem that regulate the respiration rate. The inspiratory center. This reticular formation is in the medulla oblongata. The expiratory center. This reticular formation is also in the medulla oblongata. The pneumotaxic center, and this has various nuclei of the pons of the brain, and the apneustic center also deals with the nucleus of the pons. The first two centers are present on the medulla oblongata, whereas the last two centers are present on the pons region of the brain. Involuntary control of respiration. The pattern of motor stimuli during breathing can be divided into inspiratory and expiratory phases. The medulla regulates the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. The pons coordinates the speed of inhalation and exhalation. Ventilation is normally controlled by the autonomic nervous system with only limited voluntary override. Ventilatory rate is tightly controlled and determined primarily by blood levels of carbon dioxide as determined by the metabolic rate. Blood levels of oxygen become important in hypoxia. Remember, hypoxia is a condition where there is a lack of oxygen. These levels are sensed by chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata for pH and the carotid and aortic bodies for oxygen and carbon dioxide. So this brings us to figure 23.24 on page 927. And this shows the location of areas of the respiratory center. So the respiratory center is composed of neurons in the medullary respiratory center in the medulla plus the pontine respiratory group and the pons. So the box in the upper right is showing part of the brain where you can see the medulla and the pons. And then you can see where these nerves are going in relation to the thoracic cavity. And you can see the phrenic nerve there that's attached to the diaphragm. And if you recall, we talked about the phrenic nerve during the nervous system lectures. So this figure is on page 928. This is 23.25. And it shows the roles of the medullary respiratory center in controlling A, normal quiet breathing, and B, forceful breathing. So during normal quiet breathing, the ventral respiratory group is inactive. During forceful breathing, the dorsal respiratory group activates the ventral respiratory group. So please spend a little bit of time on this figure by yourself, studying the various steps of this process. Moving on to control of respiration, cortical influences allow the conscious control of respiration that may be needed to avoid inhaling noxious gases or water. And this voluntary control of breathing originates in the cerebral cortex, hence cortical control. And the chemoreceptors. So central and peripheral chemoreceptors monitor levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide and provide input to the respiratory center. So feedback control. Receptors play important roles in the regulation of respiration. Central chemoreceptors of the central nervous system located in the ventrolateral medullary surface are sensitive to the pH of their environment. Peripheral chemoreceptors act most importantly to detect variations of the oxygen in the arterial blood, in addition to detecting arterial carbon dioxide and pH. And mechanoreceptors are located in the airways and parenchyma. They are responsible for a variety of reflex responses. Voluntary control of the respiration. Regulation of the respiratory rate is dependent on conscious and unconscious thoughts, emotional status, anticipation. Ventilation is temporarily modified by voluntary acts and complex reflexes such as sneezing, straining, burping, coughing, and vomiting. And this figure is on page 929, figure 23.6. This shows the locations of the peripheral chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors are sensory neurons that respond to changes in the levels of certain chemicals in the body. Moving on, hypercapnia. This is a slight increase in the pressure of carbon dioxide and thus hydrogen ions, and this stimulates the central chemoreceptors. Hypoxia. This is an oxygen deficiency at the tissue level, And this is caused by a low oxygen pressure in the arterial blood due to high altitude, airway obstruction, or fluid in the lungs. And this figure is on page 930, figure 23.27. This shows the regulation of breathing in response to changes in the blood carbon dioxide pressure, the blood oxygen pressure, and the pH via the negative feedback control. So if we look at this, we can see an increase in arterial blood carbon dioxide pressure stimulates the dorsal respiratory group. And this, of course, is another example of a negative feedback loop. And this brings us to table 23.3 on page 931. So this summarizes the stimuli that affect the breathing rate and the depth of breathing. So please study this table on your own time. Coughing and sneezing. Irritation of nerves within the nasal passages or airways can induce a cough reflex and sneezing. These responses cause air to be expelled forcefully from the trachea or nose, respectively. In this manner, irritants caught in the mucus which lines the respiratory tract are expelled or moved to the mouth where they can be swallowed. During coughing, contraction of the smooth muscle narrows the trachea by pulling the ends of the cartilage plates together and by pushing the soft tissue out into the lumen. This increases the expired airflow rate to dislodge and remove any irritant particle or mucus. Next slide. Cough reflex. This is a protective reflex caused by irritation of parts of the respiratory tract beyond the nose like the larynx, trachea, and bronchi. Irritation of any of this part causes stimulation of the vagus nerve and cough occurs. Cough begins with deep inspiration followed by forceful expiration with the closed glottis. So the interpleural pressure rises above 100 millimeters of mercury. Then the glottis is suddenly opened with an explosive outflow of air at a higher velocity. So the irritants may be expelled out of the respiratory tract. Next slide. Coughing is of major importance, as it is the body's main method to remove dust, mucus, saliva, and other debris from the lungs. The inability to cough can lead to infection. Deep breathing exercises may help keep finer structures of the lungs clear from particulate matter, etc. Moving on to the sneezing reflex. It is also a protective reflex which occurs due to the irritation of the nasal mucous membrane. During irritation of the nasal mucous membrane, the olfactory receptors and the trigeminal nerve endings present in the nasal mucosa are stimulated, leading to sneezing. Sneezing starts with a deep inspiration, followed by forceful expiratory effort with an open glottis, and the irritants are expelled out of the respiratory tract. Respiratory volumes and capacities. A breath is one complete respiratory cycle that consists of one inspiration and one expiration. An instrument called a spirometer is used to measure the volume of air that moves into and out of the lungs, and the process of taking the measurements is called spirometry. Respiratory pulmonary volumes are an important aspect of pulmonary function testing because they can provide information about the physical condition of the lungs. The amount of air that is inhaled and exhaled in a normal, quiet breathing cycle is approximately 500 milliliters. This is what we call tidal volume. Respiratory capacity is the sum of two or more volumes. Factors such as age, sex, body build, and physical conditioning have an influence on lung volumes and capacities. Lungs usually reach their maximum in capacity in early adulthood and decline with age after that. So recording respirations. We would do this to monitor a patient with breathing problems, to aid in the diagnosis of disease, and to evaluate the response to medication that affects the respiratory system. The rate of respirations, depth, and pattern of breathing should be recorded. The depth of breath is known as the tidal volume, and this should be around 500 milliliters. We said that on the previous slide. The rate should be regular with equal pause between each breath. The rate can be irregular with disease of the respiratory system. Any irregularities should be noted and reported to the medical team. When observing the respiratory rate, it is important to note the color of the patient's lips. They may be cyanosed, a little bit blue, or discolored if the patient has respiratory problems. Cyanosis can also be observed in the nail bed, tip of the nose, and in the earlobes. Counting respiration. Respirations are when you breathe in and out. Your respiratory or breathing rate is the number of times you breathe in and out in 1 minute. Most people breathe in and out 12 to 20 times every minute. The respiratory rate can show how the person's body is doing. A change in the respiratory rate may be a warning sign that the person's condition is getting worse. Next slide, how to count a person's respiration. Ask the person to sit upright. Try to count the other person's respirations without them knowing. If he or she knows, he may try to control the breathing. This can give a false respiratory rate. Use a watch with the second hand and count the breaths for 60 seconds. Use any of the following methods to count. Look at his chest rise and fall. One rise and one fall are counted as one breath. Listen to his breaths. Or place your hand on the person's chest to feel the rise and fall. Exercise in the respiratory system, and this begins on page 931. The respiratory and cardiovascular systems make adjustments in response to both intensity and duration of exercise. As cardiac output rises, the blood flow to the lungs, termed pulmonary perfusion, increases as well. The oxygen diffusing capacity may increase threefold during maximal exercise, so there is a greater surface area available for oxygen diffusion. The development of the respiratory system. This is figure 23.28 on page 933. So during weeks 16 to 26, lung tissue becomes highly vascular, and the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and some primary alveoli develop. The respiratory system develops from endoderm and mesoderm. Aging in the respiratory system. Aging results in decreased vital capacity, blood oxygen level, alveolar macrophage activity, ciliary action of the respiratory epithelia. Consequently, elderly people are more susceptible to pneumonia, bronchitis, emphysema, and other issues. And this brings us to our focus on homeostasis, and this is on page 935. And this discusses the contributions of the respiratory system for all body systems. So primarily, the respiratory system provides oxygen and removes carbon dioxide, and it helps adjust the pH of body fluids through the exhalation of carbon dioxide. So study this focus on homeostasis on your own time. And now we'll talk about disorders and homeostatic imbalances. So some disorders and homeostatic imbalances include asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, lung cancer, pneumonia, tuberculosis, the common cold, pulmonary edema, cystic fibrosis, asbestos-related diseases, sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, and acute respiratory distress. Next slide. Disorders of the respiratory system related to the cardiovascular system include pulmonary embolism, This is when one or more pulmonary arteries in your lungs becomes blocked by blood clots that travel to the lungs from the legs. Pulmonary hypertension. This is a type of high blood pressure that affects the arteries in the lungs and the right side of your heart. Congestive heart failure. The heart's pumping power is weaker than normal. With heart failure, blood moves through the heart and body at a slower rate, and pressure in the heart increases. As a result, the heart cannot pump enough oxygen and nutrients to meet the body's needs. The chambers of the heart may respond by stretching to hold more blood to pump through the body or by becoming stiff and thickened. Moving on to hyperventilation. This may be caused by abnormally low levels of carbon dioxide in the blood and lead to dizziness, lightheadedness, weakness, unsteadiness, muscle spasms in the hands and feet, and tingling around the mouth and fingertips. Causes include anxiety, head injury, cerebral vascular events, inappropriate use of stimulus drugs such as the excessive intake of aspirin. So usually what happens when a person hyperventilates is that you get a paper bag and you have them breathe in and out of the paper bag, and that helps to elevate the level of carbon dioxide in the blood. On the other hand, hypoventilation, this is where the breathing is not adequate to meet the needs of the body, so the breathing is too shallow or too slow. Hypoventilation causes an increase in blood carbon dioxide levels and a decrease in blood oxygen levels. And there are many causes, and some of these causes include obesity, obstructive sleep apnea, severe chest wall deformities, neuromuscular diseases, severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, congenital central hypoventilation syndrome, and apnea. Disorders related to the nervous system. Neurotoxin. So this is a poisonous complex that acts on the nervous system. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a rare disorder in which the body's immune system attacks your nerves. Weakness and tingling in your extremities are usually the first symptoms. And myasthenia gravis. This is a chronic condition that causes muscles to tire and weaken easily. For example, if you have myasthenia gravis, you may notice that during a meal, your jaw muscles become tired and weak, and this interferes with your ability to chew food. After you have rested for a little while, the muscles may become strong again, and this will allow you to resume eating. There are also restrictive disorders of the respiratory system. Emphysema is one of them. Emphysema is a type of COPD involving damage to the air sacs, alveoli, in the lungs. As a result, the body does not get the oxygen it needs. Emphysema makes it hard to catch breath. The most common cause is cigarette smoking. If you smoke, quitting can help prevent you from getting the disease. If you already have emphysema, not smoking might keep it from getting worse. The treatment for emphysema is based on whether your symptoms are mild, moderate, or severe. Treatments include inhalers, oxygen medications, and sometimes surgery to relieve symptoms that prevent the complications of emphysema. So yeah, if you're a smoker, it's a good idea to quit. Smoking gives rise to many problems of the respiratory system, and that includes smoking weed, smoking cigarettes, and I would assume vaping too, though there's not as much data on vaping at this point in history. Some other disorders of the respiratory system include pneumonia, tuberculosis, respiratory distress syndrome, also known as hyaline membrane disease, and this occurs almost exclusively in premature infants. Pleuroeffusion. A pleuroeffusion is an abnormal amount of fluid around the lung. Pleuroeffusions can result from many medical conditions. Most pleural effusions are not serious by themselves, but some require treatment to avoid problem. And the most common causes are congestive heart failure, pneumonia, liver disease, end-stage renal disease, nephrotic syndrome, cancer, and pulmonary embolism. Pneumothorax. A pneumothorax is a collection of free air in the chest cavity that causes the lung to collapse. Pneumothorax may occur on its own in the absence of underlying disease. This is termed spontaneous pneumothorax. Pneumothorax may also occur as a consequence of an injury or underlying lung disease. This brings us to the next slide. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. And this can include asthma, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. Immune function. Airway epithelial cells can secrete a variety of molecules that aid in the defense of the lungs. These secretions can act directly as antimicrobials to help the airway free of infection. Most of the respiratory system is lined with mucous membranes that contain mucosal-associated lymphoid tissue, which produces white blood cells such as lymphocytes. I remember we talked a little bit about that in the chapter on the lymphatic system. And that concludes tonight's lecture.